The early morning sun was still struggling to climb over the Black Hills as Sally Preston stood at her front door, clutching a basket of laundry. The peace of her small South Dakota town was only interrupted by the rustle of the wind and the occasional chirp of birds. But that quiet was shattered when a man, stumbling with blood soaking through his shirt, collapsed in front of her. His eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, met hers just before he collapsed at her feet. James Black Barr. The name popped into her head almost instantly, though she'd never seen him before. He was a notorious figure in town, whispered about in the hushed tones of the local diner. A member of the Black Hills gang that had terrorized the area for years. He was known for his ruthless ways and the scars on his reputation. And yet here he was, bleeding out in front of her, his life in her hands. Sally froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. But then, as his labored breathing filled the air, something inside her shifted. She couldn't just turn him away. She knew the risks. The consequences of aiding someone like him were unthinkable. But the faint, pleading look in his eyes, the way he gripped her porch railing to keep himself upright, told her that this was no simple thug. This was a man, desperate and broken, in need of help. "Please," he gasped, barely able to form the word. Sally swallowed hard, her mind racing, but before she could think, her hands were already pulling him inside, away from the cold, away from the world he had left behind. As she closed the door behind her, she could hear the distant rumble of thunder, ominous, like a storm was coming. Once inside, Sally guided him to a chair, his body heavy with the weight of both his injuries and his past. She worked quickly, tearing at his shirt to get a better look at the wound. The bleeding was bad, but it was manageable. Her fingers trembled as she cleaned the gash, her mind swirling with a mix of confusion and fear. She'd helped injured animals before, but never a man like him, a man who, for all she knew, had done more harm than good in the world. As she carefully wiped away the blood, she saw the tattoos, the scars, the marks of a man who had lived a life far from the one Sally had ever known, a dark, twisted life. And then it hit her, the realization of just who she was helping. "You're him, aren't you?" she whispered under her breath. The Black Hills gang had been the stuff of rumors and nightmares, and now, standing right in front of her, was one of the very men who had kept the town in a constant state of fear. His eyes flickered, a quick, silent acknowledgement. He didn't need to speak for her to know the truth. Sally felt her heart drop into her stomach. The town had suffered enough at the hands of men like him. She knew the pain they had caused, the lives that had been ruined, the families left broken. And now, here she was, holding the life of one of those men in her hands. Her chest tightened. The temptation to turn away, to slam the door and pretend none of this was happening was overwhelming. But she couldn't. For reasons she didn't fully understand, there was something in his eyes that kept her from walking away. Sally had spent her whole life teaching young minds the importance of compassion, of seeing the potential for change even in the most troubled souls. Was she really going to abandon that belief now? Was she going to ignore the small flicker of humanity she saw in this man, no matter his past? She couldn't. The voice in her head that told her to help him was stronger than the fear that knotted her insides. But as she pressed the clean cloth to his wound, she couldn't help but wonder, was she making a terrible mistake? The man she was helping wasn't just wounded in body. Sally knew that. He was a man shaped by years of choices that left scars deeper than the one on his chest. But she had to decide. Would she stand by her belief in redemption, or would she turn her back on the very thing that had always guided her life? As the door behind her creaked open, the sound of footsteps growing nearer, Sally felt a sudden wave of doubt. She might be healing his wound, but could she ever heal the damage he'd caused to so many others? The day after James Barr arrived at Sally's doorstep, the calm of her home shattered like a fragile glass. As the sun began to sink behind the hills, the peaceful town seemed to hold its breath. Sally sat by the fire, watching over James, still unconscious from the blood loss and exhaustion. The quiet outside her windows was a stark contrast to the chaos she knew was coming. She hadn't told anyone about James, not even her closest friends. But the moment his face appeared in the doorway, everything changed. The rumors that had followed him for years, the whispers of his deeds, didn't just stay in the corners of town. They reached the ears of his gang. Sally was jolted from her thoughts when a loud knock rattled the door. Her heart skipped a beat. The tension in the air was palpable, heavy, as if the storm clouds outside were reflected in the weight of what was coming. Her pulse quickened. She glanced down at James, still pale and unconscious. If anyone had known what she was doing, what she had done, they would have called her a fool, a coward. But it was too late for that now. She was already in too deep. A voice called out from outside, harsh and familiar. "We know you're in there, Preston. Open up!" Sally froze. Her blood ran cold as the realization hit her. The gang. They were here. Led by Tim Wild Harris, the Black Hills gang had been responsible for countless robberies, violent raids, and the kind of terror that made people lock their doors at night. Tim was known for his unpredictability, a ruthless leader who got his nickname from his savage temper and ruthless drive to dominate. And now that storm was coming for her. She stood up, her heart hammering in her chest. The door had no chance against the thugs outside. They had seen too many towns fall apart under the weight of their terror. They weren't here to talk, to reason. They wanted their own. And they wouldn't leave until they had him. Sally's thoughts raced. What would they do if they found him? She had no illusions about what a gang like this was capable of. They would kill James without a second thought, but they might not spare her either. In fact, she could already imagine the twisted satisfaction in Wild Harris's eyes when he saw her standing there, choosing to protect the very man responsible for so much harm. Sally's hand shook as she reached for the gun she kept in the kitchen drawer, a tool she had never thought she would need. She had never considered herself the type to resort to violence. But as the sound of the gang's boots grew closer, something within her hardened. The door shook with another violent knock. Sally's heart raced, but her mind was clear. She had a choice to make. She could run. She could leave and save herself. The Black Hills gang would never give up on finding James, but at least she might get away with her life. But the thought of running, of turning her back on James after everything she had done, was something she couldn't live with. She hated what the gang had done, hated the fear they spread, the damage they caused. It was a deep, searing hatred that burned through her every time she thought of their victims, the families torn apart by their greed, the scars left on the town, and here they were, standing at her door, ready to take James, ready to rip her world apart. Sally had always believed in redemption, in second chances, but that belief was beginning to feel like a fragile thread, one that was unraveling with every step the gang took closer to her. She could feel her hatred growing, not just for the gang, but for herself as well. What had she done? What had she brought into her home? This wasn't just about helping a wounded man anymore. It was about taking a stand against everything that had torn this town apart, against the very kind of people who had made life hell for so many. Her finger brushed against the cold steel of the gun, and for the first time, she understood what it meant to choose a side. James Barr, despite all he had done, was still human. He was wounded, vulnerable, and she couldn't turn away from that. She hated the man for his crimes, but she couldn't turn him over to the gang either. In that moment, Sally realized that this wasn't just about saving him. It was about confronting the deep darkness the gang had left in the town. Sally opened the door, the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders like a leaden burden. She saw Tim Harris standing at the front, grinning with that cruel, twisted smile. "You made a mistake, Preston," he sneered, looking past her. "That man belongs to us." Sally's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood firm. "I'm not letting you take him," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear twisting inside her. For the first time in a long while, Sally felt a deep, burning hatred for the people who had made this moment inevitable. They had pushed her to this point, forced her to become something she never thought she'd be. But as she looked at the gang before her, she realized one thing. No matter what happened next, she wouldn't let them win. The storm outside seemed to pale in comparison to the chaos that was about to unfold inside Sally's house. The door crashed open, splinters flying as Tim, Wild Harris, and the rest of the gang poured in, their heavy boots pounding against the wooden floor, their eyes wild with rage. Sally's heart slammed in her chest, her breath short as she stood frozen, for just a moment, facing the nightmare that had been slowly creeping into her life. She was trapped, the walls closing in, and all the while, she could feel the weight of her decision. The man she had chosen to help now, at the center of her darkest fears. "Get out of the way, Preston," Tim snarled, shoving her aside as the gang made their way deeper into the house. "We'll take him now." James, who had been silently lying on the floor, slowly sitting up, his face pale, his body weak, suddenly stirred. His eyes darted between the gang and Sally. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, perhaps unsure of what he could still salvage, if anything. But the fire in his eyes shifted. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else, a determination. Sally's breath caught in her throat. Without warning, James lunged to his feet, grabbing for the revolver she'd kept on the mantel. In an instant, the room exploded into gunfire. The bang of bullets deafened her, her heart leaping in her throat. She ducked, instinctively, her body pressing against the floor as shots ricocheted off the walls. The chaos was brutal, deafening. Her thoughts scrambled to make sense of it all, but one thing was painfully clear. The man she'd taken in, the one she'd helped despite everything, had just made his choice. He betrayed his own gang. Sally's eyes widened in disbelief as James, moving with a sudden, desperate aggression, fought back against the very people he had once called comrades. The gang, caught off guard by his defiance, faltered for a moment, their eyes filled with a mix of confusion and rage. But as the gunfire echoed through the room, there was no mistaking the sound of his betrayal. James had turned against the gang that had shaped his life. The gunfight raged on, and Sally's mind was a blur of confusion and fury. She scrambled to the corner of the room, desperately trying to make herself as small as possible. Her hands shook, not from fear alone, but from the anger that was boiling inside of her. How could he do this? How could the man she had believed in betray everyone so easily? He had been her only hope, her symbol of redemption, but now it felt like the bitterest kind of deception. Sally's chest tightened, her breath coming faster, her heart hammering. She watched as James moved across the room with lethal precision, his former gang members now targeting him with all the venom they had left. It wasn't just survival at this point. This was a man fighting for something more. Or so she thought, until the moment when the truth hit her, like a slap across the face. James wasn't fighting for her. He wasn't fighting for redemption. He was fighting for his own survival. The revelation was like ice water in her veins. Her hands, once trembling with the desire to help, now clenched into fists at her sides. She had put her trust in him, had hoped that by saving him, she was saving something more. But what had she really done? Had she only been a pawn in a game she hadn't understood? James fired another round, taking down one of his former gang members, and for the first time, Sally saw him clearly. A man who had once fought his battles with the same violence he now used to protect himself. The same man who had allowed a path of destruction to follow him for years. She had believed in his potential, in his promise of change, but in this moment, Sally realized that was nothing more than a fragile illusion. Her anger wasn't just for the gang anymore. It was for herself, too. She had believed in him. She had fought against her better judgment and gone against every warning to help him. And now, standing in the middle of this chaos, she understood the harsh truth. She had been wrong. As the gunfire slowed and the dust began to settle, Sally stood there, a deep ache filling her chest. The world around her felt distorted, twisted by the choices she had made, and for the first time, she questioned whether any of it had been worth it. Was James worth it, or had she simply made the biggest mistake of her life? The battle in the house was over. The gang members lay motionless, but the emotional wreckage was far from finished. Sally didn't know if James would live through this, and part of her didn't care. Her belief in him, and in everything he had represented, had been shattered. In that moment, Sally's heart was torn between the desire to survive and the recognition of the deep, unforgiving anger she now felt toward the man who had brought her to this point. The truth was hard to swallow, but it was undeniable. She had been a fool, and now it was too late to turn back. The silence in the house was deafening after the last of the gunfire had faded away. Sally stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of what had just happened. The gang was decimated, but the cost had been greater than she could have imagined. James lay on the floor, his blood staining the wooden floorboards, a faint breath escaping his lips as he fought to hold on to life. His body was broken, battered by the chaos he had unleashed, and Sally knew the end was near. But even as his life slipped away, his eyes remained clear, filled with a fierce determination. He had chosen to fight for his survival. And in that final act, he had taken down the very gang that had terrorized their town for so long. Sally knelt beside him, her heart heavy with grief. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to comfort him. But words felt hollow. All she could do was hold his hand as the light faded from his eyes. The man she had tried to save, the man who had come into her life like a shadow, was gone. But in his death, something had shifted in the world around her. The Black Hills gang, once feared and ruthless, was no more. The police arrived shortly after the gunfight, and their investigation quickly unraveled the criminal empire that had plagued the region for years. News of the gang's downfall spread like wildfire, and the town, which had long lived in fear, began to breathe again. The streets were quieter, safer, and there was a palpable sense of relief in the air. As the days passed and the truth of the gang's crimes was slowly revealed, Sally found herself at the heart of a community that was slowly healing. The weight of her choices didn't leave her. It never would. But as she walked through the streets of the town, she felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. She had made a choice that had put her life in jeopardy. She had helped James, a man with a violent past, even though she had no idea where that choice would lead her. But in the end, it wasn't just the gang that had fallen. It was the cycle of fear that had gripped the town for years. The shadow that had loomed over them had been lifted, and with it came the chance for a new beginning. Sally stood at the edge of town one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt as if she had done something right. There had been no easy answer, no perfect outcome, but there had been justice. She had helped a man find redemption, even at the cost of her own safety, and while she would carry the scars of this experience for the rest of her life, there was solace in the knowledge that the town, and perhaps even James, had found the peace they had long been denied. The satisfaction wasn't in the death of the gang, or even in the death of James. It was in the quiet understanding that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the greatest change. Sally had chosen to believe in the possibility of redemption, and though it had cost her, she had proven that even in the darkest of circumstances, there was light to be found. As the wind swept through the town, Sally took one last look at the horizon. She knew that, while her life would never be the same, she had played a part in something greater. She had given a man a chance to change, and in the end, that had made all the difference. Justice had been served, had been